2020 has proven to be a year full of surprises, good and bad. Well, mostly bad. Much of the world is still trying to get back on its feet while the economy is in dire straits. However, there are a few industries that are thriving in the current situation, video games being one of them. That said, the industry is not without its uncomfortable changes and predicaments. Hi, I'm Ishaq, and welcome to the iXie Gaming podcast. To say that the industry is seeing some radical changes this year would be quite the understatement. From an unconventional next-gen race to record-breaking numbers in terms of player engagement across the board, to rush production of high-tier games in order to make the most of the situation, things appear more frenetic than they usually do. But there is one thing that not many are talking about that could have long-term ramifications on how games are marketed. Something that appears poised to completely nullify some much-loved industry traditions. I'm of course talking about the rise of digital showcases from various outlets, a platform that is now looked upon as the gateway to said outlets' reach towards its customer base. While most industry gurus see this as a positive approach, it does come with a whole lot of baggage when looked from a broader perspective. Let's take a better look at these digital showcases in today's podcast. There can be various arguments made on how the idea of digital showcases was born or who did it first. But we'll stick with Nintendo as they are the ones who truly started this trend with a successful showcase replacing a traditional press conference at E3 and with their Nintendo Direct presentations. At the time, these showcases certainly stood out as they were quite well made and were effective in communicating Nintendo's messages the way they wanted. Of course, this also meant that these shows were lacking the sense of a big event and all the attention that would accompany an E3 press conference. But that didn't seem to matter as this new format of messaging proved rather effective and was attributed to the success of various titles on the Switch and even the hardware itself. Unsurprisingly, this success started garnering attention from everyone in the industry. And then Sony, who were then looking at a change in strategy in light of a new console on the horizon, eventually started its own digital showcase in the form of State of Play. A show that stuck to the Nintendo Direct formula for the most part and kept the players updated on upcoming projects and new releases for the PS4. The early shows were underwhelming enough to have PlayStation fans yearn for the company's next big E3 press conference. But Sony then announced that they will skip E3 in 2020 and instead engage with the player base by various other means, State of Play being one of them. At the time, Sony's decision was both shocking and insightful as it clearly showed the faith the company had on its digital events, so much so that they would rely on it to carry the messaging and marketing for perhaps their most important product yet, the PlayStation 5. Meanwhile, on the other side of the pond, Microsoft was all set to make the most of the situation with a traditional E3 presentation with a massive blowout of games and reveals for their next console. Clearly, Microsoft identified that there is still a lot of love for the grand E3 conferences among the players. As we all know, that did not pan out as planned thanks to the worldwide pandemic. Sony's decision to pull out of GDC shortly after only emphasized the gravity of the situation. At this point though, E3 and major other events were still a possibility, but eventually they too were cancelled by the organizing bodies. Companies that were previously exploring the feasibility of digital events and those that weren't were all forced to look for alternatives now to carry their marketing forward. And digital events seemed like the obvious choice. And just like that, almost every major publisher or studio that would have had a presence at E3 at some capacity was preparing their own showcase with their own brand name and title. Now, an event like E3 has its own pros and cons. We have seen the highest highs like Sony's 2016 conference and the lowest lows like Konami's 2010 conference. But it is safe to say that companies were getting the hang of this for the most part and knew what pitfalls to avoid and how to elevate anticipation for their biggest titles. But a digital event was a whole new ballgame, and companies needed to decide what announcements and reveals would help or hurt their PR in much less time than they were used to, in a format that they were not necessarily familiar with. One of the best examples for this is Microsoft. While Sony had already planned on skipping E3 and was preparing for their PS5 reveal show months or maybe even a year ahead, Microsoft had to quickly go back to the drawing board after having done the prep work for E3. Not that everything was last minute, but when a big corporation like Microsoft prepares for a public event in the wake of a rather important product release, that calls for a lot of careful planning and execution becomes even more crucial. So, would a 90-minute long presentation with all reveals showcased in one shot work? Or does the 30 to 40-minute long showcase scattered across a few months work better? What are the games that will be ready to be showcased at the time? What would the tone of the event need to be like? These were the questions that Microsoft and other companies now faced and had to decide on just a few months before they went live. Perhaps as a result of such dilemmas, Microsoft did not quite stick the landing with their first digital event centered around the Xbox Series X. Sony's event that followed only made Microsoft's fumble even worse, as their event seemed to be better thought out and produced. But Microsoft's first event isn't the only casualty here. Ubisoft recently had their first digital event in the form of Ubisoft Forward. While there was nothing fundamentally wrong with the show itself, pretty much every element of surprise was ruined thanks to leaks or earlier announcements. Watch Dogs Legion had a good amount of screen time, but its ambitious concept was not as awe-inspiring this time thanks to players knowing what to expect from it. Their Battle Royale game, Hyperscape, which would have been a big surprise, was already announced a few days prior to the event, and I still cannot understand why they would do that. Finally, what could have been the highlights of the show was spoiled by full-blown leaks just days before the show. Far Cry 6, featuring everybody's favorite villain Gus Fring himself, Giancarlo Esposito, had seen its full trailer leaked online, and since there was no gameplay from the game in the event, all of the hype fizzled out. Assassin's Creed Valhalla saw the full 30-minute demo leak in what appeared like an earlier version of the game, but it was very close to what was shown in the event. And the parallels drawn between the aesthetics of The Witcher 3 and Valhalla only dampened the pedigree of the reveal, and the bugs noticed in the Valhalla gameplay within the Ubisoft event did not help matters. How this piece of gameplay made it to the event, I don't know. But that only goes to show that despite what the company thinks of digital showcases, they are not immune to these kind of predicaments. Yes, the companies can be more in control of what they show and how they show it, but when a mistake happens, they end up right at the mercy of relentless comments on the internet. What's even more surprising is that Ubisoft, despite all of this, officially announced that there will be a next Ubisoft Forward, quote, later this year. And that makes a stronger case for the prevalence of such events. Companies, at least this year, are trying to make up for their absence at events that could have been a platform for their staged presentations through these digital events. That, combined with the need to have more shows from Sony and Microsoft's perspective in order to prepare for the launch of their consoles, and the historic frequency of Nintendo Directs and State of Plays have made way to the inherent expectation of multiple events from any outlet that partakes. Given the fumbles and mishaps so far, this seems like a very interesting thing to watch out for. That said, the likes of Microsoft seem to have already learnt a great deal, and their recent Series X game presentation certainly shows that, the Halo Infinite controversy aside. Their recent event was much better, with overall better production values and a relentless blowout of announcements. If anything, we can only expect their following showcases to be just as well done, if not better. As we enter August, rumors suggest events from Sony, Microsoft, and WB Interactive are incoming this month alone. But rumors are still rumors, so it would be interesting to see how they pan out and if these events will be of any significance if they do happen. So what does all this mean? Are these digital events just a detour until companies get back to E3 when things fall back in place? Or will companies choose to replace traditional stage presentations for good? Or will these digital events evolve into something else altogether? Take a look at Devolver Digital this year, for instance. They put up a virtual trip of their supposed E3 booth via a Steam application just after their parody of other digital showcases, which is an E3 tradition I really like, by the way. The application, which was a hybrid between a first-person shooter and a virtual marketing platform, was rather well done, and it managed to succeed in the goal it was trying to achieve in a very Devolver Digital way. However, if we isolate this idea and take a closer look, a few challenges stand out. While this seems like a great alternative, a production like this would have costed resources within the development team, unlike a stage presentation or a digital event. Plus, it also requires far more internet bandwidth from the consumer than it would to just watch a digital event, not to mention the requirements of graphics hardware and HDD space on the PC. So it looks like this may not be widely adopted in the long run. If we turn our attention back to digital events and shows like E3, there are a few points to be noted. Big names like Bethesda have not announced any digital event and have instead chosen to feature their already announced games in Sony's showcase. So chances are they might be a part of E3 if and when it happens. Microsoft in their current state is a firm believer in being consumer friendly, and they do understand the importance that an event like E3 poses for the players. I believe time will tell whether companies choose to stick with the convenience of choosing their time and messaging thanks to the flexibility that digital events offer, or if they side with tradition and make E3 as big as it once was. If the former happens, will there be hope for flamboyant stage presentations anymore? I'm not sure. Personally, I relish moments like the appearance of Kevin Butler in Sony's conference back in 2010 and all the goofiness that ensued with the Konami's conference the same year, and the boldness of Microsoft's grand stages every year. There is something about E3 and such presentations that evoke a sense of grandeur, something that is missing from these digital events, and something that, for me personally, only Sony's PS5 reveal event has come close to achieving so far. Here's hoping that whatever route the companies choose to take, they find ways to have our jaws drop genuinely like they used to. So, what is your take on digital events? Or E3 for that matter? Which digital presentation has been the best so far? Will these events play as much a part in the success of the launch of new consoles as the games they are going to be launched with? Let's discuss these and more in podcasts to come. Until then, I'm Ishaq, and this has been the iXie Gaming Podcast. You take care, stay safe, and keep gaming.